Picture this: a quiet dojo in Texas, late afternoon sun streaming through wooden blinds. An aging martial arts legend is teaching kids the basics: discipline, respect, humility. His hands, weathered but still powerful, guide a young student through a kata. This is Chucknorris, 70-something years old, content in his twilight years, wanting nothing more than to pass on what he's learned to the next generation. He's fought his battles, won his wars. Now he just wants peace. But peace, as we know, doesn't always come to those who deserve it most. Because rolling up to that humble dojo in a blacked-out SUV is Steven Seagal, ego inflated, cameras in tow, and a chip on his shoulder the size of Hollywood itself. What happens next isn't just a confrontation between two aging action stars. It's a masterclass in what happens when arrogance meets quiet strength. And trust me, the lesson Steven learns today, he'll never forget it. Chucknorris had long ago made peace with who he was. The movies, the memes, the mythology that grew around his name, none of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the small dojo in Arlington, Texas, where every Tuesday and Thursday he taught a mixed class of kids and adults. Some came because of his name. Most stayed because of his heart. At 73, Chuck moved with the careful precision of someone who understood his body's limits, but refused to surrender to them. His kicks weren't as high anymore. His punches weren't as fast. But his spirit, unbreakable. And his philosophy had evolved from strike first, strike hard, to something far more profound. Strength is quietest in those who have nothing left to prove. He'd watched his own legend grow into something cartoonish: Chucknorris facts, internet jokes, t-shirts claiming he could roundhouse kick the sun into submission. He chuckled at them, never taking himself too seriously. Fame was a wave that had already passed. Now, in the stillness of his dojo, he found something more valuable than any black belt or movie contract: purpose. His students loved him not because he was Chucknorris, but because he remembered their names, asked about their families, and never made them feel small for struggling with a technique. To them, he wasn't a legend. He was Sensei Chuck, patient, kind, and unshakably present. But legends, even retired ones, cast long shadows, and sometimes those shadows attract the wrong kind of attention. Steven Seagal had a different relationship with his legend. Where Chuck had let go, Steven had gripped tighter. At 71, he still wore his black GI everywhere, still darkened his hair, still spoke in that low, measured tone that once made him seem mysterious, but now just seemed rehearsed. Hollywood had moved on from him years ago, but he hadn't moved on from Hollywood. He'd spent the last decade reinventing himself as a self-defense guru, posting videos demonstrating techniques that real martial artists quietly mocked. But Steven didn't hear the mockery, or if he did, he dismissed it. In his mind, he was still the Aikido master who'd taught Anderson Silva, still the action hero who'd never lost an on-screen fight. What ate at him, though, was Chucknorris. The memes, the adoration, the respect that Chuck commanded without even trying. Steven wanted that. No, he felt he deserved that. And if Chuck wouldn't share the spotlight, Steven would take it. So he arrived at Chuck's dojo on a Thursday evening, 3 cameras and a small crew in tow, claiming he wanted to exchange techniques and bridge the martial arts community. But his eyes told a different story. They scanned the humble space with barely concealed contempt. The worn mats, the handwritten schedule on the wall, the children's belt rack with crayon-drawn names. Chuck was in the middle of teaching an elderly woman a gentle self-defense move when Steven walked in without knocking. The class went silent. Everyone recognized him, but the energy shifted immediately, not with excitement, but with discomfort. "Chucknorris," Steven announced, his voice carrying that theatrical rumble. "I've been looking for you." Chuck turned slowly, taking in the scene. The cameras, the smirk, the manufactured drama. He'd seen this before, the young fighters who wanted to make a name by challenging the old guard. But Steven wasn't young. He was just desperate. "Steven," Chuck said evenly, "what can I do for you?" What followed was a masterclass in passive aggression wrapped in fake respect. Steven talked about true martial arts, about real-world application, about how some people rest on their laurels while others continue to evolve. Every sentence was a veiled insult, and the cameras captured it all. Chuck's students shifted nervously. They could feel the tension building, see their teacher's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. But Chuck remained calm, his voice steady as he asked Stephen to please leave, as class was still in session. I think, Stephen said, stepping closer, that your students deserve to see what real technique looks like. Not movie fighting, not nostalgia. He gestured dismissively at the room. Authentic martial arts. Chuck felt something old stir inside him, something he'd spent years tempering. It wasn't fear. It was the warrior recognizing a threat. But he'd learned long ago that the greatest victory was the fight you didn't have. Stephen, I'm asking you nicely. Please leave my dojo. Stephen smiled, and it was the ugliest thing Chuck had seen in years. Or what? You'll roundhouse kick me? He turned to the cameras, playing to his imaginary audience. Chucknorris can't back up his legend anymore, so he hides behind children and senior citizens. The elderly woman Chuck had been teaching spoke up, her voice quavering but brave. You should go. Sensei Chuck asked you politely. Stephen barely glanced at her. Lady, the adults are talking. That was the line in the moment. Chuck felt his students looking at him, waiting to see how their teacher would respond to disrespect, not just to him, but to them. In that moment, Chuck's mind flashed back 40 years. He saw himself as a young champion, hungry and aggressive, using his fists to prove his worth. He remembered the anger that had driven him, the insecurity masked by trophies and titles. He remembered the exact moment that had changed everything, when his own teacher had told him, any fool can throw a punch. It takes a master to know when not to. Chuck had spent decades learning that lesson, mastering restraint, understanding that true strength wasn't about domination. It was about protection, about standing up not for your ego, but for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. He looked at his students, the 12-year-old girl who'd been bullied until she found confidence here, the middle-aged man rebuilding his life after divorce, the elderly woman learning to feel safe in the world again. They weren't looking at him to be Chucknorris, action hero. They were looking at him to be what he'd promised to be, their protector. Stephen was still talking, still performing for his cameras, when Chuck made his decision. Okay, Stephen, Chuck said quietly. You want to see technique? I'll show you technique, but not here. Not in front of the children. Outside. Just you and me. No cameras. Stephen's eyes lit up. This was exactly what he wanted. Fine by me, old man. They moved to the parking lot behind the dojo. Stephen insisted on keeping one camera running, positioned on his SUV. Chuck didn't argue. Let him have his footage. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the pavement. Stephen limbered up theatrically, throwing elaborate strikes at the air. Chuck simply stood there, hands at his sides, watching. Last chance to back down, Stephen said, still playing to the camera. I don't want to hurt a legend. Chuck's response was barely a whisper. You couldn't hurt me if you tried. Stephen charged. It wasn't Aikido. It was raw ego, a looping haymaker meant to end things fast. Chuck moved like water, slipping the punch with minimal effort, his 73-year-old body remembering what his mind had never forgotten. He didn't counter. Not yet. Stephen threw another punch, then another. Chuck avoided them all, his movements economical, precise. He wasn't trying to embarrass Stephen. He was simply showing him the truth. All that aggression, all that performance, meant nothing against real skill. Frustrated, Stephen grabbed for Chuck, trying to apply an Aikido wrist lock. It was sloppy, mechanical. Chuck reversed it gently, turning Stephen's own momentum against him. Stephen stumbled, caught himself, his face flushing red. Stephen, Chuck said calmly, stop. But Stephen couldn't stop. His entire identity was wrapped up in this moment, in proving something to someone, to everyone. He came again, harder, sloppier, desperate. This time, Chuck ended it. A simple trip, perfectly timed, using Stephen's own forward energy. Stephen hit the pavement hard, the wind knocked out of him. Chuck stood over him, not gloating, not triumphant, just tired. You came to my dojo, Chuck said, his voice carrying that Texas drawl that had softened over the years but never disappeared. Disrespected my students, called me out to prove some point to the internet. But you know what, Stephen? I already know who I am. I don't need to prove anything anymore. The question is, do you? Steven's cameraman had captured everything. Within hours, the footage was online. But it didn't show what Steven had hoped. It showed an aging man, blinded by ego, attacking someone who clearly didn't want to fight. It showed Chucknorris defending himself with minimal force, offering multiple chances for Steven to walk away. It showed dignity versus desperation. The internet, predictably, went wild, but not in Steven's favor. The comments weren't about Chucknorris facts or tough guy memes. They were about grace under pressure, about a man who chose restraint until the moment he couldn't, about what real mastery looked like. Steven disappeared from social media for weeks. His videos got quietly taken down. Some said he was embarrassed. Others said he was finally facing the truth he'd spent decades running from. Chuck went back to teaching his Tuesday and Thursday classes. The incident brought some unwanted attention. Journalists, bloggers, people wanting his side of the story. He declined every interview. There's no story, he told them, just an old man protecting his students. But to those students, there was a story. They'd seen their teacher, their kind, patient, humble teacher, become someone else for exactly as long as necessary. They'd seen that strength and gentleness weren't opposites. They'd learned that the quietest person in the room is often the most dangerous, not because they want to hurt you, but because they don't. So what's the lesson here? It's not that Chucknorris is some untouchable badass who can't be beaten, though at 73, he certainly proved he's no pushover. It's not even about Steven Seagal's fall from grace, though there's definitely a cautionary tale there about what happens when you confuse fame with substance. The real lesson is this: the people who have nothing to prove are often the ones with everything worth proving. The loudest voice in the room is rarely the strongest, and true mastery isn't about domination. It's about knowing when to act and having the restraint to wait for that moment. Chucknorris spent decades building his legend, then decades more letting it go. He found peace in teaching, purpose in protecting, and strength in restraint. Steven Seagal spent decades trying to be someone he wasn't, and in one desperate moment, showed the world exactly who he'd become. There's dignity in knowing when you've had enough. There's power in walking away. And there's something profoundly beautiful about a warrior who chooses peace right up until the moment peace is no longer possible. In the end, Steven Seagal challenged Chucknorris. But the real challenge wasn't physical. It was whether Chuck would sacrifice his peace for someone else's ego. He didn't. He simply did what was necessary, then went back to being exactly who he'd always been. The strongest people you'll ever meet aren't the ones who always win. They're the ones who never needed to fight in the first place.